purísima, sin pecado concebida.
In the midst of our global climate crisis, the urgency to address environmental degradation and climate justice is undeniable. It is time to listen to different voices, the voices of Mother Earth guardians and the voices of women's empowerment at the front lines of intersectional climate justice.
All humans, all species, all geographies.
For me, nature just means life. It's life for so many beings, human and non-human, and for me, it brings me peace and joy and health.
Nature to me is connected to life and to breath.
Nature for me is my measuring stick. It is the thing that gives me perspective and scale. When I'm in nature, I am constantly in awe of things that are much larger than me, like a whale or an iceberg, and it makes me feel small. I really enjoy that sensation of feeling powerless and dependent on these huge forces around me.
It's a reflection of deeper and wider relationships with the environment and with the land, and a reflection of our current ways of interacting, our lifestyles, our capitalist global economy. And I think for me, most importantly, the climate crisis is an unsettling disconnect from land and from nature. So I think it's a few things. It's a result of our uncontrolled consumption, our global economy, unhealthy and unsustainable lifestyles. But for me, the most important is the disconnect from the land and other beings that inhabit the land. My main role in climate change or climate action has always been as a facilitator and as a teacher. So I've taught for maybe over 16, 17 years now, different levels. Now I'm a university professor and I work with students from all over the world. Some students are coming out of high school and some are already professionals. And I teach about topics related to climate adaptation and justice, and specifically emphasize Indigenous rights, agroecology, and gender. And I say that's my main role, is teaching.
Oftentimes we don't think of teachers, professors, educators as activists, but educators plant seeds. I am one of the co-founding members of Feminist Agenda for a Green New Deal, which is an international coalition of women working for feminist solutions for a global Green New Deal. In 2019, I went to the United Nations UNFCCC COP25 in Madrid, the International Climate Negotiations. I was able to participate in a press conference with women from WeCan, which is the Women's Earth and Climate Action Network. We do Women's Environment Development Organization, and the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. And that was really important for me and meaningful, that I was able to learn from these frontline Indigenous women of color and also represent the United States. And I think oftentimes when we talk about climate justice, it's seen as like a global South issue, and that the United States is just the perpetuator of environmental violence. And for me, it was important to say, hey, there's frontline communities here in the United States. The global South exists in the global North.
I work with elementary school students and increase their kind of communication skills with their body through capoeira, so through song and dance. And in some of the exercises that we have, we'll talk about why it's important to practice peace, protection, and play with our bodies and with each other, and how that relationship is connected to everything else around us. So I think primarily through dialogue about increasing awareness for the importance of tender relationship to self first, because anything that doesn't start with self might be in vain. Those efforts might be futile. The relationship between our body is reflected to the relationship that we have to our environment and to our world.
As a negotiator, when I get to attend the climate COPs, I like to think that I am leading by building communities, by creating these conglomerates of like-minded people that want to drive more ambition. There is actual measurements of how women are between 4 to 5 times more vulnerable to the impacts of climate change worldwide on average. And this has many, many causes, right? So you can point the finger at things like the fact that women are less likely to be landowners. They are more likely to be the ones caring for elders and children in the family. So they have these multiple hats they have to wear. Many of them are not educated or don't have a job outside of the house that brings them an income. So they are not as economically independent to just flee an area if it becomes threatened or vulnerable. This is about educating girls. So this is not something we can pretend to just bring in the women at the top level. And this has to be an intergenerational dialogue. When we think about gender perspective, I think it's not the only angle. We also have to include an intergenerational perspective here.
We need to actually address gender inequity in our day-to-day lives for us to be able to mainstream it into climate action. Because what we see in this world through many different factors is that women, Black, Indigenous women of color, are experiencing inequity due to things like patriarchy, due to things like white supremacy. And these are groups of people whose needs and voices are often absent in climate science or disproportionately represented in science, policy, and action.
A gender perspective is so important when addressing climate action because when we don't have a gender perspective, we actually exacerbate harm. And so when we don't center the communities, the individuals, the bodies that are most at risk of violence, then we really waste resources. We also perpetuate the myth that climate change is an issue that only impacts certain communities or that it's an issue that only white male climatologists should care about. So a gender lens is so important. It ensures that we have greater access to housing justice, transportation justice, healthcare. A gendered lens, or I say an intersectional lens, puts all of these intersections of identities at the forefront. And that's what's so unique and important.
The word is one word, not two words for the people. Say, this is new, this is old. No, it's together. Because indigenous culture is, you see the maize, the corns? Those are the people. Those are the people living all time, the same air, the same moon, the same sun, the same earth. That's the same, everybody.
The climate crisis and gender cannot be considered in isolation. Rather, gender must be incorporated through a multicultural, multidimensional, and multi-generational lens. We wanted to showcase the efforts of diverse women and their commitments to confronting the climate crisis. In this narrative, women are leaders, scholars, educators, and activists, and it is through their personal histories that they advocate for justice, so that it is truly sustainable, collective, and restorative. We dedicate this to those caught in the crossfire of social and environmental injustice. Why is the climate crisis important to you, and what inspires you to act?
I spent a lot of years of my childhood with my grandma. So she taught me from a very young age, like 3 years old, as far back as I can remember, that we shouldn't waste any food. Even if we had a little piece of carrot or zucchini that went into the bread, she taught me how to compost. She lived on a farm, but I lived with her in a urban area, and she used every space of her tiny urban lot to grow food.
The climate crisis is important to me because I care that my community, people of color, indigenous folk, women, low-income individuals are able to survive and thrive.
The wonderful Cristiana Figueres inspires me when she explains that one must be steady on the goal, but flexible on the path. As decision makers addressing climate change, there are so many variables to consider and so many different values that are affected that I often try to think back to this mantra of hers and try to keep what it is that we want to accomplish very clear. At the same time, I try to be one of those leaders that offers alternatives and a suite of options so that people can lead in their own way, a way that safeguards whatever it is that they care about. Because if we just force climate action on people, I don't think that will ever work. Everybody has to feel like an involved stakeholder and an active participant. And that's exactly what the spirit of the Paris Agreement achieved. Every country identifies its priorities, its values, its strategies. And of course, this is tricky because it's not binding, and that makes us all nervous. But if we just impose it, I don't think that would ever work. We know from social sciences enough that if people are not convinced that this is in their best interest, they are just simply not going to do it. So her type of leadership, I think, demands that we all step up to becoming leaders ourselves. We all have to find our own way.
Deanne Nishimura Thornton is my personal inspiration. She's constantly pushing conversations and initiatives about climate justice forward. Her life's work is dedicated to preserving the indigenous Hawaiian land, and we've been friends since 7th grade. She continually inspires me to want to care more about the earth I inhabit. Love you, Deanne.